It's an absolute delight for me to be interviewing my great friend, Dr. Bradley Thayer, who I first met um, in conjunction with the Committee on the Present Danger China, an organization that agitates in every way against what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing. Brad, you also participated in many of our World War III conferences, and you keynoted our War Against Men conference. Not that that conference was about just, woe is me on the part of men, that there's a war on men, but that the war on men is specifically a communist attack. So I've known you in your various ways that you speak out against communism in all its guises. And it's just terrific to be interviewing you today. So glad to have you join me, Brad. Thank you.
Karen, it's my pleasure to join you, and thank you so much for what you do through American Freedom Alliance and all of the other activities that you've joined, the conferences that you've organized and hosted, which I think have brought together. I know you've done so many, and particularly the World War Z conferences, that were the World War III or World War
Yes.
Z, as you want to say, that you organized and hosted in critical swing states to help President Trump, of course, and have his victory, of course, in 2024 by illuminating the danger from the Chinese Communist Party and how it was only Trump who was advancing. I was well aware of that danger and taking measures, necessary measures, to fight the Chinese Communist Party, whereas the Democrats were doing everything they could do to, in essence, work against the identification of the Chinese Communist Party as the existential threat that it is.
And this is to me one of the more and thank you, by the way. That's very kind. It was a real honor to be hosting those conferences, as you say, in swing states. To me, knowledge is power, and one needs the correct knowledge, accurate knowledge and wisdom and facts and an understanding of the actual state of the geopolitical state of the world in order to make the best possible decisions. And one of the things that stuns me, and again, this is why we took our World War III conference, World War Z, on the road, was we fight against an unbelievable juggernaut of misinformation, of concealed information. During the original Cold War that you came up through, as did I, against the Soviet Union, everyone in America knew, they may have disagreed to various degrees, but everyone knew we were in a bipolar world. Everyone knew it was capitalism versus communism. They, everybody knew that the world was divided into these two spheres, and we generally had a sense that it was good versus evil. We were on the side of good, and the Soviet Union was on the side of evil. At the very least, we were freer than they were. We had greater prosperity than they did. Now, in the current situation that we find ourselves in, and again, this is why we took the World War III, World War Z conference on the road, there seems to be a complete ignorance, not only about how profoundly evil the Chinese Communist Party is. I'm not going to say China, but the party under which they are living, one could call it an illegitimate regime, and it is, in fact. The people there are also suffering, as, by the way, did the Russians under the Soviet regime. And yet we are completely ignorant over here about the bipolar nature, about the capitalism versus communism, about the evils that are perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party on its own people, and that China is, in fact, as was the Soviet Union, an existential threat against us. To what can you account for this utter ignorance?
Well, I think it boils down to three elements. First, the differences between the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the Cold War with the Chinese Communist Party is the first element there. The Soviets, of course, did not want to be part of our economic ecosystem. They were explicit about labeling us as a threat and did everything they could do to defeat the West, working to undermine it domestically through communist parties, through the Comintern and Front, or the Communist International, Third International, or Communist International, which worked through front organizations, for example, to run espionage and to undermine governments throughout the West, indeed the world, including China. So the Soviets were very much an aggressive state, but not wanting to be part of the West. And so that ultimately led to their downfall in conjunction to the heroic measures that the United States and its allies took. Pope John Paul II, Maggie Thatcher, and of course Ronald Reagan were all critical there. The Chinese are different in this Cold War because they learned the lessons from the Soviets, the mistakes the Soviets made. So Deng Xiaoping explicitly recognized that what he needed to do was to adopt a Leninist new economic policy. What he was going to do was ditch communism and embrace capitalism, as Lenin did after the horrific and disastrous experience of war communism at the beginning of the Bolshevik regime. So what Deng Xiaoping recognized was the West could become a partner in allowing the Chinese Communist Party to grow and thrive and ultimately become the existential threat that it is today. And to do that, he needed partners in the West. And he found willing partners in the United States who were willing to invest and to make manufacturing, of course. And then, as we know, the rest is history in terms of what Deng Xiaoping was able to do. I often call Deng Xiaoping the greatest strategist of the 20th century because he saved communism in China, and he was able to use the capitalists basically to do so and to ensure that. Second big element there is American education and American awareness. The Soviets were very much, again, aggressive, as I stressed, and as you well know, Karen, with your background in national security. But it was also the case that Americans were more aware of communist ideology. Explicitly, they'd been taught that, and that was part of the milieu, of our cultural milieu, that communism was not American, it was anti-American, it was anti-Western, and it was a cancerous and very dangerous force. And so the West broadly was well aware of the dangers of that and an inexorable aggression that communism faces, that as Lenin identified, and Trotsky, Lenin, and other, really the founders of Bolshevism, sought to ensure permanent warfare against bourgeois societies in the West to destroy them. So there was an awareness that Americans had that was lost in the post-Cold War period. To a degree, and part of the end of history moment, as Francis Fukuyama, I think, quite colorfully and illustrated, that we were at a time where many in the West believed that liberalism and democracy and a capitalist economic system were going to dominate the world forever. And of course, that was just a conceit, sadly. And as a result of that, the removal of the Soviet Union, time passing, generational time passing, Americans lost really the awareness of communism as a threat. It was seen to be something of the past, not of the present or of the future. And again, that goes back to Deng Xiaoping's 24-character strategy, where he sought to minimize China's aggression, to minimize China's ambitions in favor of doing everything he could to open China to Western industry, manufacturing, so that he could steal knowledge, that he could, Western firms would legally as well as illegally, China would benefit from that exchange. So we lost the plot in the West on the communist threat. And you hear that again, that many folks don't believe that the Chinese Communist Party is communist, right? They think that they're capitalists and communists only in name. And then the third big element, I think, is what we need to recognize is that it was really a generation of strategists of my age who failed, that it was many of our essentially strategic forebears had fought World War II successfully and the Cold War successfully. But beginning in the 1990s and the noughties, that strategists, really American strategists, really failed to illuminate the danger of the Chinese Communist Party and what was coming our way. Deng Xiaoping was a brilliant strategist because he hid and he knew how to manipulate us. But American strategists should have said, this is what's happening. This is what we need to do. There were a few. Andy Marshall, the director of the Office of Net Assessment, quite clearly stressed what the Chinese were doing, what the Chinese Communist Party was doing. But too few individuals really recognized that. And that was due in part to the brilliance, again, of the Chinese Communist Party in reaching out to American think tanks, funding American think tanks, and American media, American universities, so that they would not call attention to the Chinese Communist threat. It was also due to the fact that I think there was the focus, of course, on the wars of the day, not a distant threat of the Chinese Communist Party, but the immediacy of the Balkans. You'll remember Bosnia, of course, Kosovo in the 1990s, the focus on Saddam Hussein, and then, of course, Gulf 9/11 took American strategists into a different environment. But there were American strategists, however few, who recognized the danger and sought to eliminate it, but they were not heeded. So we failed. That is, those in the American strategic community also failed to use their means to combat what the CCP was doing, but also to illustrate what was, to so many of us, what was obvious, that year after year, the Chinese Communist Party was getting stronger. And in a relative power sense, we were getting weaker because, of course, its power is usefully studied in an absolute sense, but also in a relative sense in international politics. They were benefiting much more from trade than we were, so they were relatively getting stronger year after year after year. And that leads us to the unfortunate situation where we are today.
It seems I want to get back to how we redeem ourselves and how there's now a shift. Maybe there was a failure in the past, but it seems like things are being stepped up. But if we could talk about how cunning Deng Xiaoping was and his successors, this notion of unrestricted warfare, they did learn from the Soviet Union. They did learn much how to be much more strategic and, again, cunning, and they've woven their way in through everywhere. So can you describe some of the main ways in which they've, I guess, infiltrated us? You mentioned funding think tanks. They're part of universities, manufacturing. So at the same time that they've infiltrated us and made us dependent in shocking ways, at the same time that they're boosting themselves, we are also starting to cower in and feel shame about who we are, which it ought to be the complete opposite. So as you noted, there's this relative strength. They're boosting, but we're also diminishing our own pride and gratitude for and recognition of the strengths that we have, again, in complete contradistinction to how it had been during the Cold War. We were good, they were evil. Now we're evil and they're good, and they're everywhere. So where all are they, and how has this come about?
Well, communists are brilliant at waging war in all azimuths. That is not kinetic war, which is what they don't want to do. They seek to undermine societies from within by waging economic means, but also political warfare. And that would be, which they're expert at because they emphasize the political. They recognize, they understand the importance of that, and they understand how to penetrate a society and influence it negatively towards communism. And so the Soviets did this against us through the Communist Party of the United States and through the Comintern. And they had supreme successes, Karen, as you may remember, right, in terms of stealing some of our technology, but also in espionage, in intelligence collection, getting Americans to spy for them and influence them, right? The penetration of the Manhattan Project, right, was perhaps the most spectacular of their successes, although they had many others. What Deng Xiaoping did was, again, much broader. and just even I think more brilliant in that evil sense, of course, than what the Soviets did. What Deng Xiaoping recognized is that American capitalists would transfer everything, and as a result of that, China, the CCP would have more wealth, which they would then spread out to the elite of American society, as well as all Western societies. And broadly today, all societies are penetrated to some degree by the Chinese Communist Party, from the Caribbean to Central America to South America, Africa, the world over, of course. And that was, you could buy academics because they're relatively cheap. Charles Lieber, the head of the chemistry department at Harvard University, right, was collecting $50,000 a month in pay from a university in China, right? And what was Lieber doing? Well, he was transferring his knowledge. Brilliant chemist, he was transferring his labs, he was transferring his syllabi, he was transferring what China needed to have, at least this university in Wuhan needed, unfortunately in Wuhan, of course, which was synonymous with COVID-19 genesis. But he was transferring that knowledge to the Chinese for $50,000 a month, right? Which is a trivial amount of money for the Chinese Communist Party. Lieber illuminates really an archetype of what we need to be aware of, which is what they had done. You've gone into think tanks. Brookings, for example, the Penn Biden Center, right? University of Pennsylvania and Joe Biden. All of these measures were taken to influence directly, but also indirectly, the illumination of the threat. It's what Jim Fennell and I call in our book, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, threat deflation. Deng Xiaoping and the CCP wanted to threat deflate, to always minimize what China was doing, and they got away with it because they were able to reach into our think tanks, media, academe, and even politicians. The Clinton administration, Karen, you'll remember well the election of 1996, where in 1995, 1996, it was revealed that Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party had been taking money from individuals who were affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party. And so they recognized, as politicians on both sides of the aisle recognized, there was a lot of money to be made in China if you didn't say anything and you just kept things going. So Clinton moved to bring them through and to ensure the renewal of most favored nation trade status, and then ultimately taking them into the World Trade Organization, which was just rocket fuel for their economy. So we need to recognize that they brilliantly targeted our centers, if you will, of ideational power, right? Where do we get our ideas? We get them from universities, we get them from think tanks. And what the Chinese did is reached in there and influenced them by spreading their money around. And it didn't cost them very much to have tremendous influence in threat deflating. So that again, when the US government wanted to ask, is there a China threat? They would go to the think tanks and they would go to academics, and the answer would be no. Well, maybe mid-century, maybe by 2049 or after, there might be something, but there's no threat today. China is just a growing power, and it's one that can be dealt with. It's one that can be essentially the Sino-American relationship need not be a hostile one. We were told that year after year after year. And so here we are today. It's a genius political warfare, and the communists are really good at it. But we are too. And we are because of the strengths of our society, which you also asked in your question, which is that we have created the best system, political system, economic system the world has known, which has provided freedom for so many individuals, right? A way of life, which is the envy of the world. And we should not be shy about touting that, about illuminating the great strengths that we have. And in contrast, the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party. Right? It's not an accident that people wanted to come to the United States by the tens of millions. Okay, if the U.S. were a gulag, right, they wouldn't come by the tens of millions, right? Joe Biden let them in, And people wanted to come here because they recognized what America was, right? And no tens of millions will ever flee to the People's Republic of China, all right? They're not going to go in there. They're seeking to escape it, not to enter into it. So that was a reminder, if we needed one, of the strength of our society. Our core ideas, the spirit of 1776, the ideas of political liberalism, which said we are individuals. We're individuals who have rights. And those rights should be protected by a form of government which is limited, where there's a rule of law, right? Where we have freedoms that are going to be protected by that government. Our founding ideas that were, of course, so successful in allowing the United States to become a colonial offshoot of Great Britain, to become, within 100 years, really a great power. And it was our ideology that allowed us to do that, and to do that successfully, and that has led us to where we are today. The fact that we have squandered that we still live off of the intellectual capital, as well as, to some degree, the military capital, if you will, the national security capital of the Cold War, really illuminates how strong we were in that time, and what we need to do to capture that. And it is, in principle, although not in practice, in principle, it's relatively easy, which is to underscore our freedoms, what our ideology is, and why it's superior to the alternatives. The communism is advanced by the Chinese Communist Party. Undoing the damage that the communists have done as they work through the ideas industry, our educational system, Hollywood, our think tanks, etc., is a challenging task, but one that Trump is up for, and I know he's going to do it.
Right. So, right. And I definitely want to talk about what he is doing, but it seems from what I'm gathering, the whole unrestricted warfare has been fighting on the political front, on the ideological front, on the economic front, and it feels like the onslaught has been so thorough. You mentioned every one of our the institutions that advance very ideological thought, our educational institutions, think tanks, media, Hollywood. China has had such a stranglehold on this that even if one wanted to disseminate the truth, you can't. Certainly during the or other Cold War, we knew we were in one, as I had said, because Hollywood, there was a whole genre, Cold War genre. There were books, there were movies, there were television shows. Universities, we knew about this. Kids knew. Now, China, the Chinese Communist Party, has a stranglehold on those institutions. And at the same time, everything that we buy is in some way connected to China. So it's the ideological, everything we know about the world, and yet also everything that we buy is connected somehow, some way. Our pharmaceuticals, our shipping, you can't go to a store and buy something that's not made in China. So as once you can identify the problem, you can come after it with solutions. It seems to me that Donald Trump understands both of these major fronts, and he is tackling them both, certainly at the university level, and now also with the tariffs. Can you talk about how, A, am I right to make these distinctions, and B, is Trump understanding this situation, and is what he is doing, are these tactics the right ones?
I think they are, Karen. It's a very important point. What Trump is doing is recognizing the vulnerability of the Chinese Communist Party, which is illegitimate. It's illegitimate because it's communist. It was put in place by the Soviet Union, right? It was founded, the Chinese Communist Party was founded in every sense that matters by the Comintern, right? In conjunction with a small number of really Chinese socialists, not really even communists. It was the Comintern that nurtured, that provided the brain for the CCP. And that's a period of their history that they always ignore and minimize. Mao Zedong took his ideas from the Comintern and from Soviet experience. So what we have in the CCP is the product of Soviet imperialism. Right? They were put in place by the Soviet Union, by Stalin, and sustained by them. And so, recognizing that fact, we can see that there's nothing Chinese about the Chinese Communist Party. There's a lot that's communist, but very little that's Chinese. So the Chinese people didn't vote for them. They didn't ask to be ruled by this Western import of Leninism. But nonetheless, here we are. And it's up to, I think, as the Chinese are recognizing, to query, as they are, why are we being ruled by this failed Western import, right? When we should be ruled by Chinese ideas, by a Chinese polity. So that illegitimacy is fundamental and can never be removed. The party is well aware of it, which is why they're so aggressive at going after and doing everything they can do to ensure that nobody touts their illegitimacy. So the party, again, also because they're communist, second point, they're always going to rule, they're always going to be corrupt, tyrannical, thuggish in the way that they rule an economy. They're never going to be a success because they control, in every sense that matters, the economic life of China. And their misrule essentially has no solution. They're always going to drive it into the ground. So China, the CCP, survives because we let it into the economic ecosystem. They're taking our ideas, our wealth. Trump is saying no more. We're going to cut that off. The trade is going to end. And of the executive orders that were announced on February 17th, very importantly, as Frank Gaffney and Brian Kennedy have touted, and Roger Robinson and so many from the Committee on Present Danger China have stressed for years, Karen, as you well know, you and I know that this has been a staple of what the Committee on Present Danger China has argued, is getting them out of New York markets. Excuse me, no longer allowing U.S. wealth to go to subsidize the Chinese Communist Party. So cutting them off from trade, they need our market, they need our wealth, they need our ideas still, is expert at putting them in a box from which there is no escape for the Chinese Communist Party. Nobody wants a war with the Chinese Communist Party, but overthrowing them using economic means as well as political means, again, recognizing fundamentally their illegitimacy, right? They have no right to rule China any more than you do, right? I mean, there's no, there were communists who were put in charge by this communist system, which was put in place by the Soviets. And so they have no right to rule China. In fact, you may have more of a right to rule, right, than the CCP does. So when we recognize that, we recognize they're beyond the bounds of international society. They should not be part of the UN. They should not be recognized. We should, Taiwan and the Nationalist Party, the KMT or GMD now, of course, or let's just call it the KMT, is in most senses, right, the rightful ruler of China. And this is why they're focused on Taiwan, because it's certainly the chips, the economic component is irrelevant, the military component and the geostrategic space that Taiwan occupies, but most importantly, to my mind, is in political warfare. The KMT, the success of Taiwan, now the DPP ruling Taiwan, illuminates that China can be a democracy. China can have a free market. They can also have free political system. And what's true of Taiwan is also true of mainland of China, ruled by the CCP. So very important developments that we have here in recognizing that this illegitimacy and their economic dependence on us still are all tools that the Trump administration is beginning to employ to ensure that the CCP can be defeated without resorting to a situation that none of us want, certainly. So all of that is very positive, and it's exactly what needs to be done at this point in time. And it really underscores the failure of the Biden administration, which was, I'm sure investigations will reveal the scope of the Chairman Comer House oversight has already shown that Chinese entities were giving millions of dollars to the family, to the Biden family. I'm sure as investigations go through, it's almost like, von Schliemann at Troy, right? You've got to go through 9 layers of corruption of the of the Biden family and their associates, et cetera, to really get to the truth of it. And I'm sure that will happen. And it will show that the issue of elite capture, where the Chinese Communist Party had used their wealth to, in essence, buy, if you will, or elite, including Biden and his family, paid enormous dividends for them and greatly hurt the United States. But people are waking up to this, right? We're reckoning up. While the elite were captured, the American people were not captured, Karen. So the American people and those of us who remember what the Cold War was and appreciate the dangers and evils of communism, right, are what we need to have. The American people were never bought off, right? The American people were always able to see the threat from the CCP. And it is upon the American people, really, that Trump is, that's the source of his tremendous support. That is why he is so strong and has that support. The American people saw what the CCP was doing. Their jobs were going, right, in the 1990s and in the noughties and in the teens, right? Their jobs were going to China, that manufacturing job. They were incurring the costs. They could see really the evil of the CCP, to say nothing of, right, the fentanyl, the narcotics that the CCP is using to undermine America, using, in all intents and purposes, a chemical weapons, chemical warfare against the United States. All of that is necessary because the CCP recognizes they're illegitimate and the United States polity is legitimate. We are a democracy, and the American people are a source of great strength. And in conjunction with the Chinese people, right, the greatest foes of the CCP. So the Trump administration is doing, already going gangbusters, and I think there's much more to come.
The America First investment policy paper, the memorandum that was signed, to me at the time just seemed like such an obvious thing. Again, original Cold War, the idea that anybody did any kind of investment with the Soviet, it just certainly it didn't happen. It was illegal, among other things. Now President Trump with an America First everything, it's so hugely refreshing. America First investment policy, and yet, first of all, for it to be required seems it really reveals how far we had come from America First. As you've noted, the Biden regime was China first. And yet, even at the same time, with this America First investment policy strategy and outlining consequences if one doesn't, still there's pushback. There's pushback through major investment firms, through corporations, through we're seeing the Democrats push back on everything America First all at the same time. What does this tell you about us as a nation? And just for me, I'm so hugely relieved that we have an America First president. I don't care who it is, but we have an America First president in the White House. You would think that would be the absolute minimum requirement of a president of a country, that he or she takes the national security of his nation and the well-being of his people as number one priority. And that we have currently such a president reveals how huge that gap has been. So you see him as doing the right thing, but what kind of pushback are you seeing, and what does it tell you about the current situation of the United States?
It shows the strength of the Chinese Communist Party and the American elite. It shows that the fact that you still have that resistance to, again, to an America First president, right? Who's going to advance American security, the well-being of Americans before all, right? Which is, again, it's such a welcome relief. My goodness, it shows the resistance shows that the CCP's penetration was done with great support by many of the elite in the American, if you will, ideational ecosystem, right? The think tanks, media, Democratic Party, and universities. The fact that they had established that dependence was a result of the fact that they either didn't understand communism or were willing to work with communism, right? Maybe they were sympathetic towards the CCP, some of them at least, in academia, and even in the Democratic Party, as the Democratic Party has moved consecutively farther to the left. Remember that U.S. Senator from Georgia, Zell Miller, wrote that great book in the 90s, right? I didn't leave the party left me, right? He was a traditional Democrat, and he saw year after year the Democrats were going to the hard left, right? Which suggested that the core of the Democratic Party, right, in terms of the elite, core elite of the Democratic Party, were heavily influenced by Leninism, right, by communist ideas, and want to move the party along those lines. And we're seeing the flowering of that with what we witness on a daily basis. So the resistance, I think, is not just rooted in a pecuniary element. It's not that you're getting rich. Yes, there is that element, certainly true. But it's also an ignorance or willingness to help communists in the CCP to keep that alive. And that fundamentally suggests that they're not interested in America first. They are not interested in the health and well-being of America or our ideas, the ideas of political liberalism, the ideas of the spirit of 1776. But they're interested in hurting that and replacing American society with something which is akin to the CCP, which is putting the United States on the path to totalitarianism, of course, which President Trump has stopped and which we need to continue to support all of his efforts to do so. So that capture of the elites goes a long way. It's not just a financial, pecuniary element. It's also an ideological element, which is really worrisome.
At the same time, we want to protect the United States and our people and so on. And there was I guess Amazon had floated this idea that when prices go up, they want to say that it's because of President Trump's tariffs, which fine. But at the same time, it seems we ought to be saying why goods from China are so cheap. And it's because of child labor. It's because of slave labor. It's because they have zero environmental protections. Everything that the left has said is important for here, they completely embrace when China is doing this. So if you talk about environmental concerns, human rights concerns, concerns for women, let's not even talk about organ harvesting, the horrors that are out of China. Every time we buy something cheap, as you say, with some pecuniary benefit to us, it really is on the back of immense suffering in
Through the
China.
coerced labor
And the
in
coerced
Xinjiang,
labor,
right?
it's tremendous. So when people say, "Oh, Trump is going to have prices skyrocket," the reason prices are as low as they are, and that you're able to buy all the unbelievable bounty that you want for ridiculously low prices, is on the backs of coerced labor, of child labor, of their words, raping the planet, and so on. So it seems we also have an opportunity, and I don't know that we're taking it quite enough, of broadcasting all these tariffs are intended to do. Can we restore some kind of human right baselines that should underlie where we get our products from?
Absolutely, and it shows that you're right, that the genocide that the CCP is committing against Muslims in Xinjiang and elsewhere, against Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz Muslims, is outrageous, and that's happening today, and it's been ongoing. So You're exactly right that low price comes at a tremendous cost, which is unacceptable. To say nothing of how they crushed the Tibetans, how they gross human rights abuses, right? The many tens of millions of people they've killed in the legacy of their rule. So the forced abortions, right? Female infanticide, all of these horrific measures need to be illuminated. And again, when they are, Americans begin to recognize that, and even the elite, who are fellow travelers, if you will, of the CCP, are going to have to be held to account for this, which is you're supporting this regime. This regime has committed gross human rights abuses throughout its history, continues to do so, lied about COVID, right? Generated COVID, lied about it, right? Which has cost us mightily. And I think one thing we should think about is maybe having a tribunal for COVID, certainly, but let's put the CCP on trial. Let's have people of goodwill from the diaspora, from others. Well, it's within living memory to talk about the horrors of the CCP during the Civil War, through the many purges, attacks against the Chinese people. They call them landlords, right? Essentially, rich peasants, kulaks, right, from the Soviet argot. The horrors of the Great Famine, the horrors of the Cultural Revolution, right? The horrors that they've inflicted. Tiananmen Square. There's, I think, quite room for, in international politics, to have an accounting of what the CCP has done, and to try them in every sense that matters, in absentia, of course, but to have these issues brought to the fore. And absolutely, the report on the wealth and corrupt practices of the CCP leadership was required by Marco Rubio, was instrumental in that. And the intelligence community was required to produce a report, open source, on the wealth and corrupt practices of the CCP, because many folks don't know that these individuals are among the richest in the world, if not the richest, because of the fact that they have fingers in every pie. They're taking a cut of every business in China as well as globally. So they're famously wealthy, right? And their wealth, of course, is in their family name, of course, or another name. But to go through there and is a serious project, let's associate the wealth of Xi Jinping's family. Let's find out what he actually owns in Belgravia, Mayfair, Switzerland, where his bank accounts are. What property does he own in Manhattan, right? And let's go through this and have an accounting. Everyone knows they're corrupt, but we haven't gone through to show that you actually own this piece of property, right? This yacht, this townhouse, right? This building in Midtown Manhattan is owned by Xi Jinping's family, right? And so he's profiting from it in that way. I won't say anything about the irony of these individuals, right, being so prodigiously wealthy, right, in a country which is still, right, which is getting wealthy on the backs of what Steve Bannon calls the Laobaixing, right, essentially the common people, ordinary people of China. But having that type of knowledge about them compels us to ask, who are these people, right? We should have no truck with them, right? We recognize with the apartheid government in South Africa in the 60s and 70s and 80s that the international community should have nothing to do with South Africa under the apartheid regime, and we worked to overthrow the apartheid regime. We need to recognize the CCP. Similar measures and tools can be employed against the CCP as well to ensure that nobody is going to have anything to do with them, given the horrific measures that they've taken against their own people, to say nothing of what they've done in international politics, backing Pol Pot, for example, right? Few people recognize Mao and Pol Pot were birds of a feather. sadly, and the CCP backed up the Khmer Rouge. The key ally of the Khmer Rouge, the only ally of the Khmer Rouge, when it committed its democide against the Khmer people, the Cambodian people, from 75 to 79, Karen, it's estimated that over 1 in 5, that's over 20% of the Cambodian population in under 4 years actually died as a result of the horrific year zero policies of the Khmer Rouge. Well, it was the CCP that made that possible. It was their support that made that possible. So we need to recognize and hold them to account for what they have done to their own population as well as internationally, and to recognize that their time has passed. Right? It's the future of this positive question of the 21st century is going to be whether the tyranny of the CCP sets the rules, the norms, the values, has the power in the 21st century, or whether liberalism, the United States, has freedom and liberty are still going to have a rebirth to reclaim the 21st century. And sadly, we're in this test. And as Americans under the Trump administration expertly are becoming aware of that, we can recognize that dispositive question will be answered favorably, and that is that we will again have a rebirth of freedom in the 21st century, and we'll hope and work towards the death of tyranny as evinced by the CCP in this century.
What you're just describing just now is exactly why we did our series of conferences, because this was the dispositive question. Which way is it going to go? And we needed, in November of last year, to at least get that one win, to have an America first, not a China first president. But that's just the first step. Now we're watching, as you say, he's doing those right things and addressing this dire situation we have been finding ourselves in. The steps are difficult, but they are absolutely, without question, the sine qua non of how we move forward. And then, as you just described, the evil that totalitarian dictatorships, communism always acts, decimating their own people domestically, going after foes foreign. I love the idea of having some kind of we wouldn't call it Nuremberg, but that kind of an international tribunal of the evils, because people need to be made aware. So I think that's a great idea. You describe in Embracing Communist China, Our Strategic Failure, and these kinds of things, and I know Frank has also in his book, The Indictments. They need to be indicted. So the work that you've done, Committee on the Present Danger of China, the books that you've written are illuminating all these issues that otherwise China, in conjunction with the American left, has done everything in its power to conceal. But you feel it's coming out, and that's going to make a difference.
It is, and it's in no small measure due to Trump and his victory in 2024, and others who banged the drum. Frank Gaffney, of course, and Brian Kennedy, and Steve Bannon, right? Again, new federal state of China. Other actors are doing what they can to do this, and with Secretary Rubio and now National Security Advisor Rubio, I think there certainly can be steps forward in that direction, and the Trump administration broadly in calling attention to this. But it also has to be done on those who are looking at the situation and doing their utmost to also call account, right? Why does Hollywood, right? Hollywood is so fearful of, I do this, of course, because Hollywood is so important, but also you're in the LA area. So it's the business. So Hollywood is so deathly afraid, right? They see their profits, right? They see income and future income as being rooted in China. Well, whether that's true or not, right? They would not do the same for South Africa during the Cold War, and rightfully so, right? So if you have this tyrannical regime, which is grossly violating human rights on a day-to-day basis, year-to-year basis, right? The idea that individuals are profiting and shaping their films in a way not to offend that tyrannical regime and to support that tyrannical regime needs to change. And so these individuals need to be held to account for that. So I think that there is a change, Karen, positively. And again, it's Trump's victory, I think, which is America's victory, the victory of the American people, allows them to recognize that we're going to have a rebirth of Western civilization. Right? We're going to be working to bring about change as Europe is going in a direction which seems to be more totalitarian, banning major actors like Le Pen in France, alternative for Germany, in Romania, right? We're seeing in the UK, right, the birth of political liberalism, right? John Locke, right? It was really the founding fathers of the ideas of political liberalism were English and Scottish. And to have their home, essentially their homelands, become increasingly dictatorial shows the pernicious element of it, and that the battle against tyranny has to be fought in all azimuths and all the time. And even in countries that should know better, like France and like the United Kingdom.
Yeah, watching Europe fall. On the other hand, we are seeing, and this is maybe why Europe is in part right now, what's happening with alternative for Germany and so on. The Trump effect scares them, I think. And so there's an empowerment that comes with it and a commensurate got to tamp them down. So we'll see how the people of Europe, the ones who haven't come here, the people of Europe stand up for their culture, their freedoms. It's yeah, Romania, England, all of these places. It's horrible to see, but I do know that their populist parties, are taking great heart from the Trump effect. So the battle is being waged over there in a way that's very different from over here. There is a fresh wind blowing though, that's that does give one heart.
Well, Trump is the leader of Western civilization
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
He is, and he is the one who's going to save it. So much is on his shoulders already, but this is as well, and it is a mighty weight to be sure, but it is one I'm sure he's willing to embrace because he knows what Western civilization brought to the world and why it needs to be saved against the foes of the Chinese Communist Party, who want to destroy it, of course, uh, as well as those around the world, but in Europe, who should know better, right? But who are quite willing to resort to the tools they have in social media, the tools they have elsewhere and other means to suppress voices that should be heard, that are demanding to be heard. And Trump is going to carry that. And we saw that at Notre Dame, right, when he was in December of 2024, where he was invited, and it was on his back, on his shoulders, that Western civilization again will be saved by his efforts against again the CCP, the external threats, but also those in the West who seek a totalitarian solution to the political problems that they face. And for them, the answer is censorship, suppression, imprisonment, right? The
Yeah,
tools of totalitarianism.
you're not allowed to run for political office, right?
Yeah.
As in Romania and in France.
Or Le Pen,
Right.
right? Where, yeah, her trial has taken her out
Yes,
in a
yes.
de facto sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's shocking what's happening there. And we see the Trump effect happening there, but I know that Democrats over here are just longing to have the same kind of tools that they do in Europe. They hate that we have the Constitution. They hate that Trump, despite being a convicted felon, could still actually run and win. And we're seeing, so it feels like the vitriol, that the level of venom has
Yes.
escalated on both sides of the.
But why 2024 was providential and why we need to be aware of 2026 and 2028, because these tools will be back with a vengeance when the Democrats return to power, if and when the Democrats return to power in 26 or obviously in 28, where that Steve Bannon always says Trump will end up in prison, and I have no doubt that that's the case.
No doubt, no
If the
doubt.
Democrats win the 2028 election, that by January 2029 he'll be in prison.
And a few tens of thousands of his closest friends and allies as well, I would imagine.
Totalitarianism doesn't stop with one person.
That's
It,
exactly
it
right.
feeds, it grows, it expands. It's always hungry, and it is insatiable.
But his courage is contagious, I believe. And I think we need to
Absolutely.
take that to heart, and to count on increasing numbers of miracles and continue to be worthy of those miracles, I think, which is.
And Americans increasingly becoming embracing that and recognizing this is common sense. That
Yes, well, that's very
what
true. That's
Trump
very
is
true.
doing is you cannot have an open border and allow untold tens of millions of individuals into your country. That's not and have it survive. To say nothing of the contempt that you hold your citizenry in. Right? Who would do that? Right? Who would undertake that action? Well, only people who had nothing but contempt for the American people as citizens and as owners of their country.
It's an extraordinary time, and much is being revealed. Well, Dr. Thayer, thank you so much. What an amazing conversation. And I want to do this again, and I know we will. But before we go, I would like to ask you for your book recommendations.
Karen, I'll, for the sake of time, give you three, and
Okay,
they
that's great.
underscore really what we've discussed today, and that is first Louis Hartz's Hartz, Hartz, the liberal tradition in America, where Louis Hartz goes through and explains what liberalism is. Right? We see individuals as individuals, not groups, unlike the communists. All individuals have rights. Those rights are given by God, and they belong to every individual. They cannot be taken away. And from those two elements, you get a third element, which is government must be controlled. Right? If men were angels, we wouldn't need government, but men are not angels, certainly. So the freedoms that we have, the liberties that we have, right, gave, if you will, that was America's political foundation. That was our ideology, which was sustained for many, many years, having recently come under a horrific assault by communists under the guise of progressivism, right, where, again, political liberalism is under threat from an anti-American ideology, an un-American ideology, which is communism. And Hartz's book goes through and tells you why that's the case, right? It's not essentially in accord with our political tradition. It's foreign to us. Second book is Thomas Paine's Common Sense, right? A pamphlet, easy read, right? But every page is golden. Every page is inspiring. Every page is motivating. To read Common Sense, whether you're a young person or whether you're middle aged or whether to pick it up again as when you're in your seniority, it's always wonderful to read that book to show what the spirit of 1776 was, how they envisioned it at that time. And Thomas Jefferson said, of course, that Thomas Paine was the great author of the American Revolution. And if Jefferson is praising Thomas Paine, then you really see that Thomas Paine got it right. So Common Sense, or his other writings, but Common Sense, of course, is key. And then I think for understanding Americanism, I always enjoy that great Jimmy Breslin book of the 62 New York Mets. Can anybody here play this game? Right? Which, of course, was the lament of the coach famously, right? When essentially the 62 Mets, until the Chicago White Sox recently surpassed that, but had the worst record in baseball. But what does it show? The book shows really what baseball is and the joy of it, and really what comes through about America when we come together, not in a political sense, when we come together in the sense of entertainment, in the sense of sport and the competitive aspect of that, but the joy that's also found in that competition. So you don't always win, as the 62 Met shows, but even when you're losing quite badly, there's much to learn about America and the behavior of American sportsmanship and American life, which is captured, of course, in that great book. So I think those are three wonderful books to read that get into really illuminate some of the key ideas of what America is and what makes America great. And it's our ideas, it's our people, it's our sport too. It's only Americans could make baseball, and it tells us a lot about the people and who we are, and a sense of fairness and sportsmanship that comes through as a result of that. So, and again, you can see why communists want to kill that, Karen, right? The Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, right? Everything has to be politicized. Everything has to fall under their totalitarian grasp, including sport, right? The sports that we enjoy, or associations like Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts of America.
Exactly. Well, it's unrestricted warfare for
It is indeed,
a
yes.
reason. I'm going to add to your three this one, your book, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. Highly recommended reading. So,
Well, Jim Fennell and I were very grateful that Steve Bannon wrote the foreword to it. So we really appreciate that. And it really shows how the CCP, essentially through their political warfare tactics and the greed of the American elite, so many of them, and many of the themes we've talked about today came to the fore that brought about this failure and what we need to do to address it.
well, thank you so much, Brad. Really, just an absolute delight speaking with you. And I hope we do this again very, very soon. Thank you
I
so
hope
much.
so. I hope so too, Karen. It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.